Creek to Gravy High, the boarding school experience at Wind River. Government Indian treaties obligated the United States to provide education for Indian children. To accomplish this, boarding schools, run by government and by church missions, were built both on and off reservations. For several generations, these schools, designed to support government assimilation policy, removed children from the Indian home environment. 3 of the 4 boarding schools at Wind River were mission schools. The Shoshone Episcopal Girls' School, founded in 1890, boarded between 20 and 25 Shoshone girls. St. Michael's, begun in 1917, a second Episcopal mission, and St. Stephen's, a Catholic mission, begun in the late 1880s, served both boys and girls from the Arapaho tribe. The government boarding school, started in 1883, replaced the earliest, an Indian day school, begun in the 1870s at Wind River Agency. This small cabin, now in the Sacagawea Cemetery, originally stood on the banks of Trout Creek, where it served as the first government school. Initially a day school and mission building, it became the first reservation home of the Welsh missionary John Roberts. Roberts arrived at what was then known as the Shoshone and Bannock Indian Agency on February 2, 1883. He and the mail barely made it through a fierce blizzard which took the life of Maggie Sherlock of Atlantic City, a young student who froze to death while attempting to return from her home south side of the reservation to a boarding school in Utah. One of Reverend Roberts' first tasks was to work with U.S. Indian agent Dr. James Irwin to establish a school for both Shoshone and Arapaho children so that they, unlike Maggie, would not have to travel far from home to receive an education. Roberts' daughter, Eleanor Markley, describes her father's early experience in her memoirs. While waiting for the first government school to be built, the Indian boys shared Dr. Roberts' cabin. The only furnishing was a carpet on the floor, well padded with straw. This made for a fairly good bed, but the fact that the smaller boys had spent the early evening on the bank of Trout Creek hunting and catching skunks was not conducive to a good night's rest. The Government Industrial School, as the first boarding school was called, stood 1/2 block east of the Church of the Redeemer at Wind River Agency. In this photo, Reverend Roberts stands with school children on the walkway next to the church. Agency buildings can be seen in the background. The government supplied no tables, chairs, or bedsteads for its new school. Roberts' daughter explains that it was the policy of the Indian Department that the older boys should make all the furniture. So, with one horse, Dr. Roberts and several of the boys went to the mountains and snaked down logs to build their furniture. Neither the missionary nor the Indian boys had any training or experience in the use of carpenter tools, but the need was desperate, and somehow they made the necessary pieces. All this was accomplished without verbal communication. The boarding school was an adobe building that was eventually enlarged to house 86 students. Bars on the windows were originally put in as much to protect the children and staff from possible attacks by hostile tribes as to keep the students in at night. A new government boarding school was completed in 1892 at the location of the present Fort Washakie Day School, not far from the local hot springs. Early students at this school had a difficult time. The school was larger than when it was located at the agency, and it lacked the more home-like atmosphere established by Reverend Roberts and his wife Laura. Many children were forced to attend at age 5 or 6, and most spoke no English. It was a rough transition with unfamiliar food, customs, and language. Originally, students had to board through the entire year. Later, parents could pick them up for weekends if they lived close enough. Robert's daughter describes the school and the critical problem it shared with other boarding schools. The original building has been added onto many times, The dormitories were bright and airy. There were many acres of land in connection with the school where boys learned about farming and stock. However, even under favorable conditions, civilization and school life were hard on the Indian children. 50% of the children died. Greatly concerned about this high mortality rate, Reverend Roberts, who continued to act as the school superintendent even after the start of his own mission school, asked the government for permission to allow pupils to spend some time at home at intervals during the school year. In 1901, he wrote as follows to the Indian Department: "The heavy death rate of the pupils is undoubtedly due to the effect of civilization upon them. In school they have good care, wholesome food, well cooked. They have plenty of fresh air, outdoor exercise, and play. Yet under these conditions in school they droop and die, while their brothers and sisters in camp live and thrive." An old Shoshone woman, Bobichee, interviewed in the 50s by the late Rupert Weeks, remembered that parents were divided as to whether or not they wanted their children to go. They had policemen to tell the Indians to send their children to school. Some liked it, others did not. They had been issuing grub to us. Now if we didn't take our children to school, they would take our ration ticket. Soon we were all scared into submission. Mr. Weeks wrote of his experience of going to the government school through the eyes of a boy called Keachin. He did not like school from his first glimpse of it, when he noted that the smaller boys wore knee pants and black stockings, and the little girls wore striped dresses. They looked so queer to him that he just stood there staring at them. Soon he saw what was wrong. They didn't have long braids. They didn't look right, and the little boy was lonesome and unhappy. These boys, photographed at the local hot springs around 1896, fit Keachin's description. Nellie Washakie, whose husband Dewey attended the government school, tells the following story about his first experience. He was 9 years old, and they brought him in. They lived at Crowheart, and old lady Whitehorse, well, she brought a whole bunch of those kids down. When she took them to the government school, she told them, "These are my kids I brought," and she got $50 apiece out of them, and they were just the neighborhood kids that she tied up in the wagon. In this picture, students line up in front of the government school with their matron or teacher and a clergyman. The publication Rules for Indian Schools, which the Office of Indian Affairs began to issue in 1890, directed that pupils at both government and mission schools attend church services. "Everything was so different," recalled Pansy St. Clair, who attended Robert's mission. "Everything from food to clothing to bedding and going to church, all that was completely different." According to Dorothy Peashey, who attended the government school, "There was just a lot of things. The way you dressed. Alice and I had these 2 great long braids that hung down our backs, plumb to the floor, and they cut it off, and that was something awful to us. It was just like cutting our throats, because you didn't believe in wearing, and you weren't brought up to have short hair." These 2 Arapaho boys from Wind River, photographed at the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania, seem to register the shock of the changes that have taken place in their lives. The photo's caption reads, "Doing squaw work," a drastic change for boys brought up hunting rabbits and doing other outdoor activities. The changing images of school-aged children in photographs illustrate the many transitions they were going through. "They were trying to make us not be Indian," explained Hazel Sage, who went to St. Michael's. As Arnold Headley put it, "They were trying to convert us, drop our language, and speak straight English. Everything we did, from table manners to cleaning floors, everything that we didn't do at home, well, we learned that there." In this photograph, taken in the late 1890s, boys and girls are gathered for a meal at the government school. The the school soon became known by the nickname Gravy High. As Val Norman explains, we called it Gravy High after we got older because all they served, morning, day, and night, was gravy. Gravy in the morning, gravy in the noon, gravy in the evening. Is it any wonder some of us picked up a lot of weight? Rupert Weeks describes his first experience eating in the school's dining room, again through the eyes of Keachin. Had he started school at the beginning of the year, it would have been easier for him. Everyone sat down on the benches. The food was put on a plate, and when he looked around, he saw that the other children did not pick it up with their hands. He did not know how to use a knife and fork. No Eyes, who sat at the same table, tried to show him, but Keachin was too bashful to try and use a fork while people were looking at him. There was a man walking up and down the dining room. Butter was being served for the first time that week, and he was trying to get the children to eat it. Their idea of butter was that it made lovely hair oil. Both the government and mission schools at Wind River had agricultural lands that were self-supporting. Students were all expected to help with the work. The idea was to teach agricultural skills and useful trades like baking and carpentry. Paul Moss, who went to St. Stephen's Mission, shown here, describes how the system worked. I helped raise a garden. We had our own bread. The sisters would make bread. Our own milk, dairy herd, and our own beef cattle. We had hams and bacon. We built a cellar for our potatoes. Vegetables we put in sand. Carrots to keep them fresh. Sold to Lander, peanuts and every kind of flour. Sweet peas and corn. Squash, watermelon, the sisters canned corn, and rhubarb. But whatever we needed, we had our own flour. Everything was done right there at the school. Some of them went down to the barn and worked with horses, some with cattle, some with cows, some with pigs, some with chickens. St. Stephen's was self-supporting. It was all organized at that time. Marie Washakie, who enjoyed boarding at the government school because there she had children her own age to play with, describes the girls' chores. I was glad to be there. We changed details every 30 days. They put me in the kitchen. I helped in the kitchen for 30 days, worked half a day, and then half a day to school. We did about everything. Worked in the laundry 30 days, worked in the sewing room for 30 days, worked in the bakery for 30 days, worked in the dining room for 30 days, worked in the dormitory, in our wash house. I don't know how many sinks we had. There were about 300 or 400 kids. We had to keep that clean. While learning skills that could potentially lead to future employment, students, especially the older ones, also provided the school economy with free labor, a fact which many resented. Discipline, especially during the early years of the government school, was strict. Schools often hired retired Army personnel to act as disciplinarians. The policy of having older children help or supervise younger ones was indispensable to teachers and administrators who couldn't communicate with the new students that knew no English. But this often led to bullying by older children who abused their position and power. Dorothy Peachy describes the situation with one school bully. She was just the meanest human on earth. She was one of the older girls that was over a number of smaller ones. We were just treated like slaves at times, and then at other times we were treated like we were in the army. I don't think I learned a thing down there but mopping floors and doing dishes. And some of the little ones, it was really hard on them, 'cause the big ones were just as mean as they could be. If they stepped out of line or fell down, this girl would raise the devil with him. And the matron stood up for her. That's what she was supposed to be doing, just like an officer in the army or something. She'd yell at you just like you were in the army. Some of them don't want to talk about it, you know. They want to forget all that. The frequent runaways which plagued the early years at the government school, and to a lesser extent St. Michael's and St. Stephen's, gave the lie to the official line that the schools were doing well in their job of assimilating students to white society. Indian police were sometimes stationed in classrooms, and even accompanied children to outhouses. Punishment for running away could mean being locked in a dark cellar known as the dungeon for up to a week with nothing but bread and water. In the late 1800s, two of the Calhoun brothers from Crowheart, ages 10 and 11, heard that their mother was very sick. They asked the government school for permission to go and see her. Permission was denied. The boys ran away and were shot down by an Indian policeman in Sand Draw, just a few miles from home. Runaway boys were made to walk in a large circle, carrying a log post or chained to a post, forced to saw wood for hours. Dorothy Peachey and Marie Washakie both remember a partially blind girl who ran away so often that, despite Reverend Roberts' protests, they chained first one and then two fence posts to her legs. One to each leg, recalled Mrs. Peachey. She used to jump out the window with those two posts. She got to where she just didn't care. Val Norman, who was sent to the school at age 5 and spoke no English, ran away frequently. The first couple of years, he recalls, were the hardest. Homesickness was the hardest thing to fight. You used to suppress that feeling. You had to have. If you showed any signs of it, well, you caught heck for it. In other words, they punished you if you're too weak to admit, I'm not liking it. You had to like it. When things began to change, they weren't still treated as they used to be. But you still had that feeling hanging over you all the time. Somewhere, somebody is going to come and, give you what for. That stayed with us a long time. It's what you call suppression. Suppressing yourself, your native tongue, and all that other traditional stuff. Well, most of us forgot it. Our elders couldn't teach us. They wouldn't allow that. So that's where most of our tradition went. It's only when the BIA changed over into this other day school that they eased up. By that time, it was too late. The semi-military nature of the government school was also evident, though to a lesser extent, at St. Stephen's and St. Michael's missions. These schools held daily classes in drill and calisthenics. At St. Michael's, children also lined up in military fashion for their daily dose of cod liver oil before filing into breakfast. The boys' dormitory at St. Michael's, shown here, typically featured government-issue blankets and army cots. This is Arnold Headley's description. We learned to march. We used to go out early in the morning, get our exercise, and march about for 15 minutes. I was one of the last few to wear those little army trousers. We used to twist them leggings around the legs. They were khaki and they made you itch. At the government school, students even marched between classes. Drill work was so thorough that many reported that later, when they went into the service, they were far ahead of other recruits on the drill field, an unexpected bonus from their school days. Unfortunately, semi-military methods were also used in the classroom. By far the most difficult adjustment that students had to make was switching from their native tongue to English. Val Norman recalls how he learned. I never spoke no English. All I spoke was the Indian language. Boy, I had to learn fast, 'cause those instructors made sure we learned fast. You couldn't talk your own language among each other. If they caught you, why, you were in for it again. You'd be facing the wall or kneeling down. Many times you worked plenty for not obeying everybody. If they think you needed it, then they'd let you have it. Some of those kids in there, they'd be up in their rooms bawling their eyes out. Even the smallest infraction. They'd get a broom, stick it right under your knee, and there you are. You squirm around and can't holler. Holler? Why, hell, nobody'd help you, because the disciplinarian is very strict. Most of that was semi-military. The man who was in charge of it was a retired Army officer. Mr. Norman and others also remember students being beaten with rubber hoses or straps. Straps mostly, he remembered. That's the only way they could drive the lessons in. You had to learn, whether you wanted to or not. That's the way I learned to speak English. The harsh life at the early government school and the reputation its students had for fighting amongst themselves was a major reason given by many of those whose parents decided to send them to mission schools instead. Distance and the number of children in a family and religious preference also played an important part in deciding where a child would go. The Shoshone Episcopal Girls' School, shown here, later known as Roberts Mission, was built on land given to Reverend Roberts as a personal gift from Washakie in 1887. Washakie, chief of the Eastern Shoshone, believed it was essential that children be educated to survive in the Indians' changing world. This view from across the school's agricultural fields shows the circular teepee, a wooden structure which Roberts built as a playhouse to combat homesickness. Here, the girls were allowed to speak their own language, sing native songs, and encouraged to practice traditional crafts, such as beadwork. The pastoral quality of this photo, with girls in white pinafores gathered together as though for protection, conveys a sense of the mission as a place of refuge and safety. The mission, which also took in orphans, was in fact remembered by many, such as Dolly Rowan and Vida Hawkes, as a kind of second home. Pansy St. Clair, who attended during the height of the Depression, also recalls that during hard times at home, when there was little to eat and often no heat, the school helped out many families. To me, I enjoyed it. It was my happy times. I enjoyed every bit of it when I was going to mission school. It taught me a lot of things, which I probably wouldn't have learned because I had too many brothers and sisters. They taught me to cook, and I enjoyed the other kids, and they had a lot of different things when we were there, and religion. Robert's family worked with him to make a success of the school, which struggled continually with a lack of funds. Reverend Roberts laid out the school's irrigation ditches, planted orchards, taught Bible studies, and led evening prayers. His wife Laura, shown here, helped with all aspects of mission life while raising her own family of 4. Later, their daughter Gwen became the school's principal teacher. Roberts also worked closely with the Arapaho clergyman, Sherman Coolidge, both in education and ministry. Although Roberts later tried, unsuccessfully, to raise funds for a Shoshone boys' school as well, he believed the girls should be educated first because they would return to the camps and raise families. Students at Roberts Mission shared in domestic chores and light farm work. The mission did not, however, have the strong vocational emphasis that the other schools had. The girls helped peel potatoes, gather eggs, and they embroidered tea towels, but hired men did the milking, butchering, and other heavy work. Nevertheless, life at the mission was primitive, and students, especially the older girls, worked hard. Dolly Rowan describes some of their chores. They had a little old cart shaped like a barrel, and it had wheels on it. 2 of us girls used to push it down, and you know the slop water in the kitchen? The kids had to wash their hands in the basin, and they would put it in a bucket, and the biggest girls would empty it in this old cart. We would take it down and dump it over the fence. They didn't have drains until years later, when they put in water. They had a cistern, and twice a week the men used to go down to Wind River and bring this old tank of water and put it in there. We had to use that water to bathe and wash our face and for whatever the cooks used. We used so much that we used to have to go twice a week. It was cold in that wagon. The mission's chapel of the Holy Saints John originally doubled as a classroom. In bad weather, school was sometimes held around the dining room table in the main building. In this early photo, there is no sign of the apple and plum trees that now shade the area. Children helped pick fruit in the fall, and occasionally the Black Bloomer Gang, as they were known, would climb up into the trees when Reverend Roberts wasn't looking and slip the fruit down their roomy bloomers to eat on the run. Reverend Roberts, who learned to speak both Shoshone and Arapaho from the old people, as Star Weed recalls, was a central figure in reservation life. With a fairly constant stream of visitors, the mission served as a community center as well as a school. The small size of the mission and Roberts' highly personal form of administration was crucial to the school's character and environment. John Roberts was remembered by many with both affection and respect. "He was strict," recalled Pansy St. Clair, "but he made you want to learn." Dolly Rowan remembers Roberts as "the most wonderful man I ever met." She summed up her memories as follows: "We all went to church and lived happily ever after. I enjoyed it. It was wonderful when I look back on it. It was a second home to me." Under the Collier administration, starting in the late 20s and continuing into the 30s, things eased up, even at the government school. Most children knew at least some English before they went, and many had grown up with it as a second or even primary language in the home. According to Suzette Wagon, "After you got used to it, then you didn't want to go home. They gave you different things at school, different every week." Schools gradually became more engaged with the outside world, and while they couldn't compete with the choices in vocational training offered by the bigger off-reservation schools, they began to address the wider range of needs that students would meet when they graduated. "I enjoyed what we learned down there," Lillian Herford recalled. "I think it was good. We had this good citizens cash store. We took turns keeping the store, and it helps. You do a bit of that and selling and keeping track of materials and what you take in. It really helped." In the 30s, the government school participated in WPA and CCC projects such as planting windbreaks. Here, the junior shop class lays a new concrete floor. In this photograph, the shop class of 1936 helps erect living quarters for the dairyman. During the Depression, school programs helped combat the grim economy. Herman Weed offered the following comments on his experience at the government school: "We had to be there, and after you got used to it, it was all right. It was just like home. I would rather have been down there, because at home you didn't have anything to do, and you didn't have to buy clothing. Like in wintertime, when you needed overshoes, they would furnish brand new ones. Overshoes, stockings, caps, long johns, gloves. They furnished everything. That was real nice. Our families didn't have to spend anything on us." An alternative to attending the Wind River schools was to go to Flandreau in South Dakota, Carlisle in Pennsylvania, the Rapid City Indian School, or others which offered students, especially those in the upper grades, a broader curriculum and wider range of training programs, such as nursing, welding, and electronics, that weren't limited to farming and homemaking. Here, two boys from Wind River pose outside the school shop at Flandreau. Groups like the government school's Drum and Bugle Corps also provided a means for students to travel outside reservation boundaries and see a bit of the world. Chris Goggles, who traveled with the band, recalls that the Drum and Bugle Corps was the first of its kind. This photo, taken in 1936 and captioned "Campus Day at the U.S. Indian School, Fort Washakie," gives another indication of the changes taking place. Sports also began to provide a means of branching out, with students competing at different schools, both locally and away from home. Here, children and adults pose with 4-H cattle in front of the government school. Suzette Wagon recalls that they used to have a great big fair. They used to have big gatherings for the Arapaho and Shoshones. They had garden fairs. They had like wheat and hay and gardens. Boy, they used to raise good gardens. I was in 4-H at that time myself. The whole school area used to be plumb full of people because that was the biggest day of their life. They held it in the gym. They had a platform out there, and they had a barbecue and ice cream social and things like that. In September of 1939, St. Stephen's was the first Wind River boarding school to convert to a day school. The government school followed 1 year later. The Shoshone Episcopal Girls' School closed its doors in 1949. Reverend Roberts, by then partially blind, was frail and elderly, and although the Shoshone petitioned the church to keep the mission open, There were not even enough funds to operate the school's furnace. In 1956, a fire destroyed the boys' dormitory at St. Michael's. The mission couldn't afford to rebuild, and the school closed down altogether. St. Michael's had added high school years to its classes in the 30s, but the Shoshone mission never went further than the 8th grade. An improved reservation road system and better transportation now gave students the option of going to nearby Lander. In 1933 and 1934, 2 or 3 Indians attended the town's public school, with the numbers gradually increasing. It was 1955, though, that marked the end of an era when the government school transferred its lands and buildings to Public School District 21. Times and attitudes have changed. Nellie Washakie remembers what her husband Dewey said. "My kids are going to make a living with the white man, and by God, they're going to know what the white man is talking about." And he never would let them talk Indian. He said, "When you get grown up and you want to talk Indian, I'll teach you. But you'll not talk Indian while you're little, because you're going to grow up in the white man's world." Now, schools teach the Indian language, and government-funded projects, like the Warm Valley Historical Project, help collect historical photographs and people's stories as part of an effort to record and preserve the history of the past. We would like to thank all of those listed below who helped with this production. Special thanks to Carl Chittum of Littleton, Colorado, and his sister Claire Matthews for letting us use Carl Clifford Chittum's early photographs of reservation life and for helping us fund their restoration work. Special thanks also to Beatrice Crofts of Lander for letting us use material from her mother, Eleanor Markley's memoir, Walk Softly, This is God's Country, and to Mildred Weeks of Fort Washakie and her family for letting us use quotes from material collected by her husband, the late Rupert Weeks. This video was funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funds to restore the Chittum photographs were provided by the Wyoming Council for the Humanities.